Bullies shoved his face in the toilet. He came back and broke their noses. The morning bell at Ridgemont High School rang out across the sprawling campus like a warning siren, calling students from the parking lot and athletic fields into the main building. Caleb Morrison stood at his locker in the east hallway, carefully organizing his textbooks for the day ahead. His movements were precise and methodical, the way someone moves when they're trying not to draw attention to themselves. He was thin in a way that suggested he'd never quite grown into his frame, with narrow shoulders and long fingers that fumbled slightly as he swapped his chemistry book for his calculus textbook. His dark hair fell across his forehead, obscuring eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, always watching, always calculating. He wore the same type of clothes every day, faded jeans, plain t-shirts in muted colors, sneakers that had seen better days. Nothing that would make him stand out, nothing that would make him a target, or so he hoped. The hope was misplaced. "Hey, Morrison." The voice came from behind him, low and mocking. Caleb's shoulders tensed involuntarily, but he didn't turn around. He knew that voice. Everyone at Ridgemont knew that voice. Brett Harmon was the kind of person who commanded attention without asking for it. He was broad-shouldered and tall, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. His father owned 3 car dealerships in the county, and Brett drove a brand-new Dodge Charger that he parked diagonally across 2 spaces every morning. He was the starting quarterback, the homecoming king, the center of every party. And for reasons Caleb had never fully understood, Brett had decided months ago that Caleb Morrison was worth tormenting. Caleb closed his locker carefully and turned around. Brett stood there with his usual entourage, Kyle Brennan, who was built like a brick wall and had the intelligence to match. Travis Vickers, who laughed at everything Brett said even when it wasn't funny. Dominic Cruz, who actually seemed uncomfortable sometimes, but never spoke up, and Jake Morrison, no relation to Caleb, who seemed to enjoy the cruelty more than any of them. They were all wearing their Letterman jackets despite the warm October weather, all standing in a loose semicircle that blocked Caleb's path down the hallway. "Going somewhere?" Brett asked, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Class," Caleb said quietly. His voice was steady, which was something. Early on, it used to shake. "Class," Brett repeated, mimicking Caleb's tone. "You hear that, guys?" He's going to class. Such a good student. Such a good little bookworm. He stepped closer, and Caleb could smell the cologne that Brett wore. Something expensive and overwhelming. "You know what I heard, Morrison? I heard you got a perfect score on that calculus exam last week. 100%, while the rest of us were struggling." Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say. Confirming it would make things worse. Denying it would be a lie, and they all knew it. "See, that's the thing," Brett continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "It makes the rest of us look bad when you do that. Makes us look like we're not trying hard enough. My dad was pretty pissed about my B-. Said maybe I should be studying more instead of practicing. You know how that made me feel." "I'm sorry," Caleb said, even though he wasn't, even though he knew the apology would mean nothing. Brett's hand shot out and grabbed Caleb's backpack, yanking it off his shoulder. Caleb stumbled slightly, but didn't fall. Brett unzipped the bag and turned it upside down, dumping its contents onto the hallway floor. Notebooks, pens, pencils, a graphing calculator, his lunch in a brown paper bag, everything scattered across the scuffed linoleum. A few students walking by paused to watch, but no one said anything. No one ever said anything. "Oops," Brett said, dropping the empty backpack on top of the pile. "Butterfingers, you should be more careful with your stuff, Morrison." They walked away laughing, their voices echoing down the hallway as they headed toward the gymnasium. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring at his scattered belongings, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation in his chest. Then he knelt down and began gathering everything, his movements still careful and methodical, even as his hands shook slightly. A girl he recognized from his English class, Amanda Chen, he thought her name was, paused as she walked by, looking like she might offer to help. But then she glanced in the direction Brett and his friends had gone and kept walking. Caleb didn't blame her. He wouldn't have helped either if their positions were reversed. By the time he'd repacked his bag and made it to calculus, he was 5 minutes late. Mrs. Henderson, the teacher, gave him a disapproving look, but didn't say anything as he slipped into his seat in the back row. He could feel the eyes of other students on him, could hear the whispered conversations. Everyone knew. Everyone always knew. The day continued in its familiar pattern. In English class, someone, he didn't see who, knocked his water bottle off his desk as they walked past, sending it rolling under the seats. In the cafeteria during lunch, he found his usual table in the back corner, near the vending machines, the one where he could eat alone without being too conspicuous. He'd brought lunch from home because buying it meant standing in line, meant being visible, meant opportunities for someone to accidentally bump into him and make him drop his tray. His mother had packed him a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a handful of cookies. She always packed too much food, as if she somehow knew he wasn't eating enough, as if she could sense his stress, even though he never told her what was happening at school. He was halfway through his sandwich when he heard the laughter approaching. He didn't look up. Looking up made it worse. He kept his eyes on his food and hoped they would pass by, but hope was a stupid thing to cling to. "Eating alone again, Morrison?" Travis Vicker's voice, high-pitched and nasal. "That's so sad. You know what's even sadder? Your lunch. Did your mommy pack that for you?" Caleb took another bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly, saying nothing. "I think he's ignoring us," Kyle said. "That's pretty rude." A hand reached down and grabbed the sandwich right out of Caleb's hand. Travis held it up, examining it with exaggerated interest. Turkey and cheese. Classic. "You know what would make this better?" He took a huge bite, chewing with his mouth open, then handed it back to Caleb. "There! Now it's got my special flavor." Caleb set the sandwich down on his tray, his appetite gone. He reached for his apple instead, but Jake was faster, snatching it and juggling it between his hands. "Nice reflexes, Morrison. Oh, wait, you don't have any." Jake tossed the apple to Dominic, who looked uncomfortable, but caught it anyway. They began playing keep away, tossing the apple back and forth over Caleb's head while he sat there, frozen, knowing that standing up would only make things worse, knowing that reacting in any way was what they wanted. Finally, Brett appeared, as he always did, the ringleader arriving to observe his kingdom. "Guys, come on, leave him alone." His voice was serious, almost kind, and for a moment, Caleb felt a flicker of something like relief. Then Brett smiled. "We don't want to ruin his appetite. He's already so skinny. Looks like he might blow away in a strong wind." They left then, taking Caleb's apple with them. He sat there for a few more minutes, staring at his half-eaten, saliva-contaminated sandwich, then packed up the rest of his lunch and threw it in the trash. He wasn't hungry anymore. He was never hungry at school anymore. The afternoon brought history class, where Mr. Patterson droned on about the American Revolution, while Caleb tried to focus on taking notes. His seat was in the middle row, which meant he couldn't hide in the back, but also wasn't right in front where the teacher would call on him. It should have been safe, but Brett sat 2 rows over, and every time Mr. Patterson turned to write on the board, Brett would crumple up small pieces of paper and throw them at Caleb's head. They were small enough that they didn't make much noise, small enough that most people didn't notice, but Caleb felt each impact like a tiny declaration of war. He didn't turn around. He didn't give Brett the satisfaction. When the final bell rang, Caleb felt the usual mix of relief and dread. Relief that the school day was over. Dread about the parking lot. The parking lot was where the worst things happened, where there were fewer teachers, fewer witnesses, more shadows and hidden corners. He took his time packing his bag, waiting until the hallways had mostly cleared before making his way to the exit. His bike was locked up near the east entrance, far from where Brett and his friends parked their cars. But that didn't always matter. Today, luck wasn't with him. As he was unlocking his bike, he heard the familiar sound of Brett's Charger rumbling into the parking spot nearby. Caleb's hands moved faster, trying to get the lock open, trying to get away before they noticed him, but the lock was stubborn and his fingers were clumsy with anxiety. "Morrison!" Brett's voice, loud and cheerful. "Wait up!" Caleb abandoned the lock and started walking, pushing his bike alongside him, but Kyle and Travis appeared from somewhere to his left, cutting off his path. He was surrounded before he fully realized what was happening. His heart rate accelerated, pounding in his ears, making it hard to think. "Where are you going so fast?" Brett asked, approaching with his hands in his pockets, relaxed and smiling like they were old friends. "We just want to talk." "I have to get home," Caleb said, his voice coming out quieter than he intended. "You have to get home," Brett repeated, that mocking tone again. "To do what? More homework? Damn, Morrison, you really need to learn how to relax, live a little, have some fun." "I'm fine," Caleb said. "You're fine," Brett said slowly, drawing out the words. "You hear that, guys? He's fine. But see, I don't think you are fine. I think you're scared. I think you're always scared. You walk around this school like a scared little rabbit, just waiting for someone to notice you. Well, guess what? We noticed." Before Caleb could react, Kyle grabbed his bike and yanked it away from him, sending it clattering to the pavement. Travis shoved Caleb from behind, not hard enough to knock him down, but hard enough to make him stumble forward into Brett, who pushed him back toward Travis. They were playing with him, passing him back and forth like a toy, and Caleb could feel something breaking inside him, something that felt like the last shred of dignity he'd been clinging to. "Stop," he said, his voice shaking now, all pretense of calm gone. "Stop!" Brett mimicked. "You hear that?" "He wants us to stop. What do you think, guys? Should we stop?" "I don't know," Travis said, shoving Caleb again. "I'm having fun." "Are you having fun, Kyle?" "So much fun," Kyle said. And he was the one who pushed Caleb hard enough to send him sprawling onto the pavement. Caleb landed hard on his hands and knees, feeling the burn of scraped skin through his jeans and on his palms. His backpack skidded away from him, spilling its contents for the second time that day. He looked up and saw Dominic standing off to the side, his face tight with something that might have been guilt, but not enough guilt to make him intervene. Jake was laughing, actually doubled over with laughter, like this was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. And Brett was just standing there, looking down at Caleb with an expression that was almost curious, like he was conducting an experiment to see how much a person could take. Caleb started gathering his things with shaking hands, and this time they let him. They'd gotten what they wanted, the sight of him on his knees, scrambling to pick up his scattered belongings while they stood over him like conquerors. When he'd repacked his bag and righted his bike, they were already walking away, already moving on to whatever they did after school, already forgetting about him until tomorrow when they'd do it all over again. Caleb rode home in silence, his scraped palms stinging where they gripped the handlebars. The ride took 20 minutes, through residential streets lined with oak trees and modest single-family homes, past the community park where younger kids were playing on the swings, past the small strip mall with its grocery store and pizza place and laundromat. His house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a one-story ranch with faded blue siding and a small front yard that his mother tried to keep neat despite working 2 jobs. He could see her car in the driveway, which meant she was between shifts. She worked as a nurse's aide at the community hospital from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening morning until 3 in the afternoon, then went to her second job at a call center from 5 until 9 at night. She had maybe 90 minutes at home in between, and Caleb always tried to time his arrival to miss her during that window, because he didn't want her to see his face, didn't want her to ask questions he couldn't answer. But today, his timing was off. He found her in the kitchen, still wearing her scrubs, eating a sandwich while standing at the counter. She looked up when he came in, and her face immediately creased with concern. "Caleb, what happened to your hands?" He'd forgotten about his scraped palms. "I fell off my bike," he said quickly. "It's nothing." She was already moving toward him, taking his hands in hers and examining the scrapes with a professional eye. "These need to be cleaned. Come here." She led him to the bathroom and made him sit on the edge of the tub while she got out the first aid kit. Her hands were gentle as she cleaned the wounds with antiseptic, and Caleb felt something hot and uncomfortable building behind his eyes. He blinked hard, willing it away. He was too old to cry because his mother was being kind to him. He was too old for a lot of things. "You've been so quiet lately," she said softly, applying bandages to his palms. "More than usual. Is everything okay at school?" "Everything's fine," he said automatically. The lie came easily now, after months of practice. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. She never pushed. She was too tired, too worn down by her own battles to fight his for him. "Okay," she said finally, "but you know you can talk to me, right? About anything." "I know," he said, and that was the truth. He could talk to her. He just wouldn't, because what was the point? What could she do? Go to the school, make a complaint? That would only make everything worse. Brett's father had money and influence. Caleb's mother had 2 jobs and barely enough energy to get through each day. The math wasn't hard. That night, lying in his bed and staring at the ceiling, Caleb thought about his father. He'd been 4 when his father died, old enough to remember fragments. A deep laugh, strong hands lifting him up, the smell of Old Spice aftershave. His father had been a Marine, stationed at Camp Pendleton, and he died in a training accident that Caleb's mother still didn't like to talk about. For years after, she'd kept his father's military footlocker in the garage, unopened and gathering dust. Caleb used to imagine what might be inside it: uniforms, medals, letters, secrets, but he'd never opened it. It felt like crossing a line into a grief that wasn't entirely his own. Now, though, he found himself thinking about it. Thinking about his father, who'd been strong and capable and everything Caleb wasn't. Thinking about how his father would have handled Brett Harmon and his friends. Probably with a single look. The kind of look that made people step back and reconsider their choices. Caleb didn't have that look. He had the look of someone who was trying very hard not to be seen at all. He fell asleep thinking about toilets, about the rumors he'd heard, about Brett's latest favorite form of entertainment. Swirly, they called it, a stupid name for a humiliating act. He'd heard Brett talking about it in the hallway last week, laughing about how they'd done it to some freshman, how the kid had cried and begged. Caleb had told himself it wouldn't happen to him because he kept his head down, because he didn't fight back, because he gave them what they wanted. But deep down, in a place he didn't like to examine too closely, he knew it was only a matter of time. The next day started the same as every other. Alarm clock at 6:30, shower, breakfast, cereal eaten standing up because sitting down felt like admitting defeat before the day even began. His mother had already left for her morning shift. She'd left a note on the counter. "Have a good day. Love you. Mom." He folded the note and put it in his pocket, a talisman against whatever was coming. At school, he managed to make it through the morning without incident. First period was chemistry, where he had a lab partner named Jenny Martinez, who was friendly but not quite friend material. She talked to him during class, but wouldn't have acknowledged him in the hallway. Second period was English, where they were reading The Great Gatsby and discussing symbolism. Caleb loved English, loved the way Mrs. Richardson talked about literature like it mattered, like words on a page could change something fundamental about how you saw the world. It was the one class where he sometimes forgot to be invisible, where he occasionally raised his hand to answer questions, where he felt something like normal. But then came lunch, and normality shattered like glass. He was in the bathroom near the cafeteria, just washing his hands and trying to mentally prepare himself for another lunch period of sitting alone and hoping to be overlooked. The door banged open behind him, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. You develop an instinct for danger after months of being a target. You learn to read the energy in a room, to sense when the air itself has turned hostile. Brett, Kyle, Travis, Jake, and Dominic filed into the bathroom, moving with the coordinated purpose of a pack of predators. The last one in, Jake, turned the lock on the door, and Caleb's heart dropped into his stomach. "Well, well, well," Brett said, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "Look who we have here. All alone. Nobody around to see or hear anything. Funny how that worked out." Caleb stood frozen at the sink, water still running, his bandaged hands gripping the counter edge. He could see them in the mirror, 5 of them, one of him, no way out. "I've been thinking, Morrison," Brett continued, moving closer. "We've been going pretty easy on you. A push here, a shove there, some messing with your stuff. But you know what? You never learn. You just keep being you, keep making us look bad. Keep acting like you're better than us with your perfect grades and your quiet little act. So I think it's time we taught you a real lesson." "Please," Caleb said, hating how the word sounded, how small and desperate it was. "Please don't." "Please don't," Brett repeated. "You hear that, guys?" He said please, like that's going to make a difference. He grabbed Caleb by the back of his shirt and yanked him away from the sink. Caleb stumbled, his feet tangling, and before he could catch his balance, Kyle had grabbed his other arm. They dragged him toward the stalls, and Caleb knew what was coming, had known it was coming eventually, but the reality of it was so much worse than the anticipation. "No," he said, his voice rising. "No, don't, please." They weren't listening. They hauled him into the nearest stall, where the toilet sat like a porcelain monument to humiliation. Brett forced Caleb to his knees with a hand on the back of his neck, pushing him down with inexorable pressure. Caleb tried to resist, tried to pull away, but Kyle and Travis had his arms pinned, and he was outnumbered and outmuscled and out of options. "Hold him steady," Brett said, his voice cold and businesslike, and then Caleb's face was being shoved forward down toward the water that smelled like industrial cleaner and something worse underneath. He had time to suck in one desperate breath before his head plunged into the toilet bowl, the water shockingly cold against his face, filling his ears and nose and eyes. He couldn't breathe, couldn't see, couldn't do anything but endure as they held him under. It couldn't have been more than a few seconds, but it felt eternal, a drowning that went on and on and on. Then they yanked him back up and he gasped for air, choking and coughing, water streaming down his face and soaking into his shirt. He could hear them laughing, could hear the sound of a phone camera clicking. They were taking pictures, of course they were, because the humiliation wasn't complete unless they could share it, unless they could make it permanent. "How's that feel, Morrison?" Brett asked, his voice full of satisfaction. "That's what you get. That's what happens when you forget your place." They shoved his head under again, and this time Caleb thought he might actually drown, might actually die here in a school bathroom with his face in a toilet while 5 people laughed at him. His lungs burned, his head pounded. The world reduced itself to the need for air, for oxygen, for anything other than this. They pulled him up again, and this time they let him go. He collapsed onto the tile floor, coughing and retching, water and mucus streaming from his nose. Through his blurred vision, he could see them standing over him, see their faces. Brett's satisfied smirk, Kyle's blank expression, Travis's continued laughter, Jake's phone still out and recording, Dominic's carefully averted eyes. "Clean yourself up, Morrison," Brett said. "You look like shit." Then they were gone, the bathroom door slamming behind them, the lock clicking open, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Caleb lay there on the cold tile for a long time, shaking, trying to breathe normally, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, he pulled himself to his feet and looked in the mirror. His hair was soaked, his shirt was soaked, his face was red and splotchy, his eyes were bloodshot. He looked exactly like what he was, a victim, a target, someone who would never fight back. He cleaned himself up as best he could with paper towels, but there was no hiding what had happened. His hair was still damp, his shirt still wet. Everyone would know. Everyone would see. That was the point. He didn't go back to class that afternoon. Instead, he walked out of the school, got on his bike, and rode home. He didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about his perfect attendance record, or what the teachers would think. He just needed to be away from that building, away from those people, away from everything. At home, he stood in the shower for 40 minutes, letting the hot water beat down on him until it ran cold, scrubbing his hair and face and body over and over again, trying to wash away the feeling of violation, the taste of toilet water, the memory of their laughter. But no amount of scrubbing could erase it. It was burned into him now, a brand that marked him as powerless. That night, unable to sleep, unable to think about anything else, Caleb found himself walking through the dark house to the garage. He stood in front of his father's footlocker for a long time before finally kneeling down and opening it. The lock was old and stiff, but it gave way with a metallic click that sounded loud in the silence. Inside, he found what he'd expected, uniforms neatly folded and smelling faintly of mothballs, medals in small velvet boxes, letters tied with string, photographs of his father in dress blues, young and proud and strong. But underneath all of that, at the very bottom of the footlocker, he found something unexpected. A journal, leather-bound and worn, filled with his father's handwriting. Caleb lifted it out carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands, and began to read. The journal entries spanned several years, from his father's time in boot camp through his deployment overseas and back home again. They chronicled training exercises, combat experiences, the bonds formed between Marines, the loneliness of being away from family. But what struck Caleb most were the passages about discipline, about control, about the difference between violence and strength. One entry, dated a few months before Caleb was born, read, "Saw a fight today outside a bar in town. Some drunk guy was harassing the bartender, got physical, and 3 other guys jumped in to teach him a lesson. They beat him bloody, and they were proud of it, like they'd done something heroic. But that's not strength. That's just cruelty with an excuse. Real strength is knowing you can hurt someone and choosing not to. Real strength is control over yourself, over your anger, over your fear. That's what I want to teach my son someday, if I'm lucky enough to have one. Not how to fight, but why not to fight. And if you have to fight, how to do it without losing yourself in the process." Caleb read that passage 3 times, feeling something shift inside him. His father had wanted to teach him these things, had planned to, had looked forward to it. But then he died, and Caleb had grown up without those lessons, without that guidance. He'd grown up thinking that enduring was the same as being strong, that not fighting back was the moral high ground. But maybe there was something in between. Maybe there was a way to stand up for yourself without becoming the thing you hated. He kept reading deep into the night and discovered that his father had been more than just a Marine. Before enlisting, he'd studied martial arts, specifically a traditional form of karate that emphasized discipline, respect, and controlled power. The journal entries described training sessions, katas, the philosophy behind each movement. His father wrote about how martial arts had saved him, had given him focus and purpose, had taught him that the body was capable of far more than the mind believed possible. In one entry he'd written, "Sensei says that a true martial artist never seeks to harm. The goal isn't to defeat your opponent, but to defeat your own limitations. Every punch, every block, every stance, it's all about understanding yourself, controlling yourself, becoming the person you want to be. And if someone forces you to defend yourself, you do it with precision and restraint. You don't beat them down. You stop them, and then you walk away. That's the difference between a fighter and a warrior. Caleb closed the journal as the first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the garage window. His eyes were burning with exhaustion, but his mind was clearer than it had been in months. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep enduring and breaking and putting himself back together only to break again. Something had to change, and the only person who could change it was him. The next morning, he called in sick to school. His mother believed him when he said he had a stomach bug. He probably looked sick enough after his sleepless night. After she left for work, he went back to the garage and spent 2 hours going through the footlocker more thoroughly. He found photographs of his father in a dojo, wearing a white gi and a black belt. He found certificates from tournaments, from belt tests, from decades of training, and he found at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, an old business card. The name on it was Frank Torino, Sensei, with an address for a dojo on the south side of town, near the industrial district. Caleb held the card for a long time, wondering if the place even still existed, if Sensei Torino was still alive, still teaching. The card was at least 15 years old, probably older, but it was the only lead he had, the only connection to the skills his father had wanted to pass down. He took a shower, got dressed, and rode his bike across town to find out. The south side was different from his neighborhood. More warehouses and auto shops than houses, more chain-link fences than white picket ones. He found the address after 20 minutes of searching, a squat concrete building wedged between a tire shop and an empty lot. The sign above the door was faded but still legible: Torino Karate Academy, traditional training. There was a smaller sign in the window: Open. Caleb locked his bike and went inside. The interior was Spartan: wooden floors, white walls, mirrors on one side, a rack of equipment on the other. The air smelled like sweat and floor polish. At the far end of the room, an older man was leading a class of children through a series of basic katas. He was short and compact, with grey hair cut military short, wearing a worn gi and a black belt that looked like it had been through wars. He moved with the kind of fluid grace that only came from decades of practice, and even while instructing the kids, there was something commanding about his presence. Caleb waited by the door, not wanting to interrupt, watching the class. The children were focused and disciplined, performing their movements with serious concentration despite their young ages. The sensei corrected them with patience and precision, adjusting a stance here, a hand position there. When the class ended, he bowed to the students and they bowed back, then dismissed them to change. Only then did he turn to Caleb. His eyes were dark and sharp, taking in everything about Caleb in a single glance: the bandaged hands, the exhausted face, the desperate set of his shoulders. "Can I help you?" His voice was rough, like gravel in a can, but not unkind. "Are you Frank Torino?" Caleb asked. "I am." Caleb pulled out the old business card and held it up. "My father trained with you, a long time ago. Daniel Morrison. He was a Marine." Recognition flickered across the sensei's face. Danny Morrison, hell of a student, fast learner, dedicated, respectful. I haven't thought about him in years. How is he? "He died," Caleb said quietly, "when I was 4. Training accident." The sensei's expression softened into something like regret. "I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good man, had real potential." He looked at Caleb more carefully. "You're his son, Caleb. And you came here because—" Caleb took a breath. "Because I need to learn what he wanted to teach me. I need to learn how to defend myself." Sensei Torino was quiet for a moment, studying Caleb with those sharp eyes. "You in trouble?" "Yes. The kind of trouble that learning karate will solve?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but I have to try something. I can't keep—" His voice broke slightly. "I can't keep living like this." The sensei nodded slowly. Fair enough. But I need you to understand something before we start. Karate isn't about revenge. It isn't about beating people up or proving you're tough. It's about discipline, control, and respect for yourself and for others. If you come here looking to learn how to hurt people, you can turn around and walk back out. That's not what I want, Caleb said. I just want to be able to stand up for myself. I want to stop being afraid. Fear isn't the problem, Sensei Torino said. Fear is natural. The problem is letting fear control you. The problem is believing that because you're afraid, you're weak. You understand the difference? I think so. We'll see. The sensei walked to the equipment rack and pulled out a folded white GI. Your father's size should fit you reasonably well. Training starts tomorrow at 6 in the morning before school. You'll come here 6 days a week, morning and evening when possible. You'll do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. You'll learn at the pace I set, not the pace you want. And if you miss a session without a damn good reason, you're out. Understood? Caleb took the GI with shaking hands. Understood. Good. Tomorrow morning, 6 sharp. Don't be late. Caleb left the dojo feeling lighter than he had in months, maybe years. He had a plan now, a purpose, something to work toward. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that. Sensei Torino didn't look like the kind of person who believed in easy. But that was okay. Caleb was done with easy. Easy had gotten him a face full of toilet water and a camera roll full of his own humiliation being passed around Ridgemont High. He went home and spent the rest of the day reading more of his father's journal, learning about the philosophy behind the training he was about to undertake. His father wrote about the importance of basics, of perfecting simple movements before attempting complex ones. He wrote about how the body and mind were connected, how training one trained the other. He wrote about breathing, about centering, about finding calm in the middle of chaos. It was like being given a manual for how to be strong, and Caleb absorbed every word. That night, he set his alarm for 5 in the morning. He folded the GI carefully and placed it at the foot of his bed. He thought about Brett and Kyle and Travis and Jake and Dominic, about their laughter and their cruelty and their absolute certainty that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. And for the first time since all of this started, Caleb smiled. Not because he was planning revenge. His father's words and Sensei Torino's warning had been clear about that. But because he was planning to change. And change, he was beginning to understand, was its own kind of power. The alarm jolted him awake at 5, and for a moment he considered rolling over, going back to sleep, forgetting the whole thing. But then he remembered the feeling of toilet water in his nose and mouth, remembered the sound of their laughter, and he was up and moving before his brain could talk him out of it. He dressed in the GI, it fit well, just a little loose in the shoulders, and rode his bike through the pre-dawn darkness to the dojo. Sensei Torino was already there, of course, moving through a series of katas with the kind of precision that made it look like a dance. He didn't acknowledge Caleb's arrival, just continued his practice until the routine was complete. Then he turned and gestured for Caleb to join him on the floor. First lesson, he said. Everything you think you know about fighting, forget it. You're starting from zero. That's not an insult, that's a gift. Clean slate, we're going to build you up the right way from the foundation. You understand? Yes, Sensei. Good. We'll start with stance. Everything comes from stance. Balance, power, control, it all starts with how you stand. He demonstrated, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, weight evenly distributed. This is Zenkutsu Dachi, front stance. You'll practice this until it's second nature, until you can hold it without thinking, until your legs shake and burn and you want to quit, and then you'll practice it some more. Ready? Caleb mimicked the stance, feeling immediately awkward and unbalanced. Sensei Torino circled him, adjusting his feet, his knees, his hips, his shoulders. Every correction felt like a revelation. Caleb had never realized how much attention a person could pay to the simple act of standing. "Hold this," the sensei said, and Caleb held it. After 2 minutes, his legs began to tremble. After 5 minutes, they were burning. After 10 minutes, he felt like his thighs were on fire, like his knees were going to buckle. But Sensei Torino just stood there watching, arms crossed, expression neutral. "When it gets hard, that's when it starts to matter," the sensei said. "Anyone can do something when it's easy. The question is, what do you do when it's hard? Do you quit, or do you push through? Do you give up, or do you find out what you're capable of?" Caleb held the stance. His legs shook violently now, and sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool morning air. He wanted to collapse, wanted to quit, wanted this to be over, but he thought about his father, about the journal entries, about strength and discipline and control. He held the stance. After 15 minutes, Sensei Torino finally said, "Enough." Rest. Caleb's legs gave out immediately, and he sat down hard on the floor, gasping for breath. The sensei handed him a bottle of water, and he drank gratefully. "Not bad," Torino said, which felt like high praise coming from him. "Most people quit after 5 minutes on their first day. You've got some fight in you. Good. You're going to need it." The rest of the session was more of the same. Basic stances, basic footwork, basic breathing techniques. Nothing fancy, nothing that looked like the karate Caleb had seen in movies. Just fundamentals, drilled over and over until his body ached and his mind was numb with repetition. By the time the session ended at 7:30, he barely had enough energy to shower and get to school by the first bell. But he made it, and that felt like a victory. He was exhausted and sore, and his legs felt like jelly, but he'd made it. He'd done something instead of just enduring. He'd taken a step toward becoming someone different. At school that day, the photos and videos from the bathroom incident had spread everywhere. Caleb heard the whispers, saw people looking at their phones and then looking at him, saw the mixture of pity and disgust and amusement on their faces. In the hallway between classes, someone he didn't even know pointed at him and laughed. In the cafeteria, he heard someone say, "Swirly boy," as he walked past. The humiliation was complete and public, exactly as Brett had intended. But something had shifted. Caleb felt it in his chest. A small, hard knot of determination that hadn't been there before. He kept his head up, not high, not challenging, but level. He met people's eyes instead of looking at the floor. He didn't smile or acknowledge the whispers, but he didn't shrink from them either. He simply existed, and that was something. Brett and his friends found him at his locker after lunch. Caleb had known they would. They were riding high on their victory, drunk on their own power, eager to see him broken. "Hey, Morrison," Brett said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from other students in the hallway. "How's it going?" "Feeling clean." Kyle and Travis snickered. Jake held up his phone, pulling up the video, ready to show it to anyone who hadn't seen it yet. Dominic stood in the back, quiet as always, his discomfort visible but not strong enough to make him leave. Caleb turned to face them. He felt the old fear, the old instinct to apologize, to placate, to make himself small. But underneath it, he felt something new, the burn in his legs from that morning's training, the memory of his father's words in the journal, the echo of Sensei Torino's voice saying, "What do you do when it's hard?" "I'm fine," Caleb said, his voice steady. Brett blinked as if surprised. "You're fine?" "Dude, everyone saw what happened. Everyone knows you're a joke. You're famous for having your head shoved in a toilet, and you're fine." "Yes," Caleb said simply. Something flickered across Brett's face, confusion maybe, or annoyance that Caleb wasn't reacting the way he was supposed to. "Whatever, man. You're even more pathetic than I thought." He started to turn away, then stopped and added, "See you tomorrow, Morrison. Same time, same place. I think you need another lesson in where you belong." They walked away laughing, and Caleb let them go. He didn't have the skills yet to do anything else, but he would. That was the promise he made to himself as he closed his locker and headed to his next class. He would train, he would learn, and when the time came, he would be ready. The days began to follow a pattern. Up at 5, train with Sensei Torino until 7:30. Shower, school. Train again in the evening from 5 until 7. Dinner, homework, sleep. Repeat. The training was brutal, endless repetitions of basic movements, holding stances until his legs gave out, practicing blocks and punches against empty air over and over until his arms felt like lead. Sensei Torino rarely praised and frequently criticized, but always with the goal of improvement, never with cruelty. "Your stance is sloppy," he'd say. "Reset and try again. Your breathing is wrong. You're holding tension in your shoulders. Relax and focus. Too fast. Speed comes from precision, not from rushing. Slow down and do it right." Caleb absorbed it all like a sponge. He learned that karate was as much about patience as it was about power, as much about knowing when not to move as knowing when to strike. He learned about ma'ai, the distance between fighters, and how to read an opponent's body language. He learned about zanshin, the state of relaxed alertness that allowed you to react without thinking. And slowly, gradually, his body began to change. The awkward, clumsy movements became smoother. The stances that had made his legs shake became solid and stable. His reflexes quickened, his balance improved. He wasn't strong yet, not in the way that mattered, but he was becoming stronger. More importantly, he was becoming more confident. Not arrogant or cocky, but quietly certain that he was on the right path. At school, the bullying continued but evolved. Brett and his friends seemed to sense that something had changed about Caleb, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. The physical confrontations became less frequent. No more bathroom incidents, no more being shoved in the parking lot. Instead, they focused on psychological warfare. More rumors, more public humiliation, more ways to isolate him and remind him that he was an outsider. Someone created a fake social media account in Caleb's name and posted embarrassing things. Someone else spread a rumor that he had a crush on Mrs. Richardson, the English teacher. They keyed his bike seat, put thumbtacks in his shoes during gym class, taped a "kick me" sign to his back between classes. Small things, constant things, designed to wear him down. But Caleb had found an outlet for his stress and frustration. Every morning and evening, he poured all of it into his training. When he wanted to scream at Brett, he channeled that energy into perfecting his kata. When he wanted to cry from the loneliness and isolation, he focused on his breathing exercises. When he wanted to give up entirely, he thought about his father and held his stance just a little bit longer. 6 weeks into his training, Sensei Torino introduced sparring. Not full contact fighting, Caleb wasn't ready for that, but controlled practice with other students, learning to apply the techniques he'd been drilling in a more dynamic context. His sparring partners were mostly teenagers and young adults who'd been training for years, and they had no trouble dominating him at first. But Torino had taught him well. When you're getting beaten, you learn faster. Caleb learned to read attacks, to time his blocks, to create openings. He took his lumps, collected his bruises, and kept coming back. One evening, after a particularly brutal sparring session, Sensei Torino pulled Caleb aside. "You're progressing well," he said, which was the closest thing to effusive praise Caleb had heard from him. "You're learning the mechanics, developing the muscle memory, but there's something missing." "What?" Caleb asked, panting and wiping sweat from his face. "Heart, fire, whatever you want to call it. You're training like someone who's trying to survive. That's good. Survival matters. But if you're going to truly defend yourself, you need to train like someone who's trying to thrive. You need to find that inner strength, that willingness to stand your ground, not because you have to, but because you deserve to. You understand?" "I'm trying," Caleb said. "I know you are." That's why you're still here. Most people quit by now, but trying isn't enough. You need to believe, really believe, that you're worth defending, that you have value, that you deserve to take up space in this world. Until you believe that, you'll always be holding back. Caleb thought about that conversation for days. He realized that Sensei Torino was right. He'd spent so long trying to be invisible, trying not to be a burden or a target, that he'd forgotten how to value himself. The bullying had convinced him on some fundamental level that he deserved it, that there was something wrong with him that invited cruelty, but that was a lie. He knew it intellectually, but he needed to know it in his bones. He started spending more time with his father's journal, reading not just the entries about martial arts, but also the entries about becoming a father, about hopes and dreams, and the kind of person his father had wanted his son to be. "I want him to be kind," one entry read, "but not weak. I want him to be strong, but not cruel. I want him to know his own worth, to walk through the world with his head up, not because he thinks he's better than anyone else, but because he knows he's not worse. I want him to be the kind of person who helps others, who stands up for what's right, who doesn't back down when things get hard. That's the man I want him to become." Reading those words, Caleb felt something crack open inside him. His father had seen value in him before he was even born, had dreamed of him becoming someone strong and good and worthy, and that person was still there, buried under layers of fear and shame and survival instinct. He just needed to dig down and find him. The transformation wasn't instant or dramatic. It happened in small increments, barely noticeable day to day, but undeniable over weeks. Caleb started sitting up straighter in class, started making eye contact with people instead of staring at his desk, started eating lunch in more visible places, not hiding in the back corner anymore. He joined a study group for calculus, started talking to Jenny Martinez outside of chemistry class, even managed to have a conversation with Amanda Chen about the English homework. None of these people became close friends. He was still too damaged, too wary for that. But they were connections, small bridges back to the social world he'd been exiled from, and he started fighting back in small ways. When Travis knocked his water bottle off his desk again, Caleb picked it up and said clearly, "Stop doing that." When Jake tried to trip him in the hallway, Caleb sidestepped smoothly, months of footwork practice paying off, and kept walking. When Brett made a mocking comment about his clothes, Caleb looked him in the eye and said, "Okay," with such complete indifference that Brett actually looked confused. These were small victories, barely worth mentioning, but they felt enormous to Caleb. Each one was proof that he could resist, that he could push back without it destroying him, and each one made the next one easier. 3 months into his training, Caleb received his first belt promotion. It was only white belt to yellow belt, the very first step in a long journey, but Sensei Torino conducted the test with the same seriousness as if it were a black belt exam. Caleb performed his katas, demonstrated his techniques, sparred with 2 senior students, and answered questions about philosophy and discipline. When Torino tied the yellow belt around Caleb's waist, he said, "This belt means you've learned the basics. You're no longer a beginner, you're a student, but don't let it go to your head. Yellow belt means you're just starting to understand how much you don't know." "Yes, Sensei," Caleb said, bowing deeply. That weekend, Caleb's mother noticed the belt when she saw him practicing katas in the backyard. She stood at the kitchen window for a long time, just watching, and when he came inside, she had tears in her eyes. "You're training," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Like your father?" "Yes." She hugged him tightly, and he could feel her shaking. "I wondered when you'd find his journal," she said quietly. "I left that footlocker unlocked on purpose, you know. I thought maybe someday you'd need what was in there. I just hoped it wouldn't be so soon." "You knew what was happening at school?" Caleb asked, pulling back to look at her face. I'm not blind, baby. I see the bruises, the way you flinch sometimes, the way you've been so quiet. But I also know you're not a little boy anymore. You needed to figure this out yourself, in your own way. I just hoped you'd find the same thing your father found. A way to be strong without being hard, a way to defend yourself without losing your kindness. I'm trying, Caleb said. I can see that, and I'm proud of you. Your father would be proud of you too. That conversation meant more to Caleb than any belt promotion or successful sparring match. Knowing that his mother saw him, understood him, supported him, it filled a gap he hadn't fully recognized was there. He wasn't alone in this. He never had been. He'd just been too afraid to let anyone close enough to help. As winter settled over the town and the school year progressed past the halfway point, things at Ridgemont High reached a kind of uneasy equilibrium. Brett and his friends still targeted Caleb, but with less frequency and less intensity. It was as if they sensed that something had changed, but weren't sure what to do about it. The easy target had become less easy. The guaranteed victim had started showing teeth, and they didn't quite know how to adjust. The shift became obvious one day in February. Caleb was at his locker between classes when Brett approached alone, without his usual entourage. He leaned against the locker next to Caleb's, arms crossed, studying Caleb with an expression that was hard to read. "You've been different lately," Brett said. It wasn't a question or an accusation, just an observation. Caleb continued organizing his books, not acknowledging the comment. "I don't know what it is," Brett continued. "You look the same, mostly. Still a skinny nobody. But something's changed. The way you stand, the way you move, like you're not scared anymore." Caleb closed his locker and finally looked at Brett directly. "I was always scared," he said quietly. "I'm just not letting it control me anymore." Brett's eyes narrowed. "You think you're tough now? You think whatever you've been doing makes you strong enough to stand up to me?" "I think I'm strong enough to stand up for myself," Caleb corrected. "There's a difference." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then Brett laughed, but it sounded forced. "We'll see about that, Morrison." "We'll see." He walked away, and Caleb felt his hands shaking slightly. It wasn't fear exactly. He'd learned to recognize fear and sit with it, to acknowledge it without letting it paralyze him. It was adrenaline, anticipation, the knowledge that something was building toward a confrontation he couldn't avoid forever. Brett felt threatened now, and threatened people were dangerous. Caleb had learned that in his training, an opponent who feels in control might toy with you, but an opponent who feels their control slipping will attack with everything they have. He was right. Over the next few weeks, Brett's behavior became more erratic and aggressive. He seemed determined to reassert his dominance, to prove that nothing had really changed. The psychological warfare intensified. More rumors, more public humiliation, more attempts to isolate Caleb from any potential allies. But he also started getting physical again in ways he hadn't for months. One day in the cafeteria, Brett, accidentally, spilled an entire tray of food on Caleb's lap. Another day, he shoved Caleb hard into the lockers in a crowded hallway, making sure everyone saw. In gym class, during a game of basketball, Brett threw an elbow that split Caleb's lip and left him tasting blood. Through it all, Caleb maintained his control. He cleaned the food off his lap without reacting. He straightened from being shoved into the lockers and kept walking. He wiped the blood from his lip and finished the basketball game. Each time, he could see the frustration building in Brett's face. Each time, Brett expected a reaction: fear, anger, submission, something, and didn't get it. But there was someone else watching these interactions with increasing interest, a girl named Rebecca Walsh. She was in Caleb's English class, a quiet girl with auburn hair and green eyes who usually kept to herself. She wasn't part of any particular social group, not popular but not outcast either, just existing in the neutral territory between extremes. Caleb had noticed her before. You couldn't help but notice her, really, but had never spoken to her beyond the occasional "excuse me" when they passed in the aisles. One afternoon after English class, as Caleb was gathering his books, she approached his desk. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Caleb looked up, surprised. "Sure." "How do you do it? How do you just not react? I've seen what they do to you, everyone has, and you just take it and keep going like it doesn't matter. How?" Caleb considered the question carefully. "It matters," he said finally, "but if I react the way they want me to react, if I break down or fight back in anger, then they win. They get what they want, and I lose a piece of myself. So I choose not to give them that. I choose to stay in control of who I am." Rebecca studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "That must be really hard." "It is, but it's getting easier." She smiled slightly. "Good. I'm glad. For what it's worth, I think you're braver than people realize." She walked away before Caleb could respond, leaving him sitting at his desk feeling strangely lighter. Someone had seen him, really seen him, and recognized something worth valuing. It was a small moment, but it mattered. After that, Rebecca started sitting near Caleb in English class. They didn't talk much at first, just small exchanges about the reading or the homework, but gradually the conversations lengthened and deepened. He learned that she was an artist, that she spent her free time painting landscapes and portraits, that she planned to study art in college. She learned that he was training in martial arts, that his father had been a Marine, that he was slowly rebuilding himself from the ground up. They started eating lunch together sometimes, at a table near the windows that got good afternoon light. Rebecca would sketch while Caleb did homework, and they'd talk about books and movies and the general absurdity of high school social hierarchies. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was friendship, and for Caleb that was almost more valuable. He'd been alone for so long that having someone voluntarily choose to spend time with him felt like a minor miracle. Of course, Brett noticed. Brett noticed everything that might represent a threat to his dominance. One day in early March, he cornered Rebecca in the hallway while Caleb was at his locker 20 feet away. Caleb couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see Brett leaning in close, could see Rebecca's face tighten with discomfort, could see her trying to step away and Brett blocking her path. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to intervene, to do something. But Sensei Torino's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't start fights. Don't seek confrontation. But if someone needs defending, if someone is in genuine danger, you act. You act decisively, proportionally, and with control. You don't become a bully in order to stop a bully." He was moving before he fully decided to move, crossing the distance between them with the smooth, efficient footwork he'd practiced 10,000 times. "Rebecca," he said calmly, positioning himself between her and Brett. "Ready for lunch?" Brett's face darkened. "We're having a conversation here, Morrison. Mind your own business." "She looks uncomfortable," Caleb said, his voice level. "I think the conversation is over." "You think you're some kind of hero now?" Brett stepped closer, invading Caleb's space, trying to intimidate him with size and proximity. "You think you can just interrupt me?" "I think you should leave her alone," Caleb said. His heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding his system, but his breathing was controlled, his stance was balanced, his hands were loose and ready at his sides. 4 months of training had prepared him for this moment, even if he hadn't known it at the time. For a second, Caleb thought Brett might actually throw a punch right there in the crowded hallway. The older boy's hands were clenched, his jaw was tight, his eyes were blazing with anger and something that might have been fear. But there were too many witnesses, too many teachers nearby, too much risk. So instead, Brett leaned in close and spoke in a voice only Caleb could hear. "You're going to regret this. You and your little girlfriend both. I promise you that." Then he walked away, his friends materializing from various parts of the hallway to follow him like loyal hounds. Rebecca let out a shaky breath and touched Caleb's arm. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Caleb said simply. The confrontation had been witnessed by dozens of students, and by the end of the day, everyone at Ridgemont High knew about it. The story grew in the telling. In some versions, Caleb had pushed Brett. In others, he'd threatened him. In others, he'd done some kind of martial arts move that had made Brett back down. None of these stories were true, but the underlying message was accurate. Caleb Morrison had stood up to Brett Harmon and hadn't backed down. That evening at the dojo, Caleb told Sensei Torino what had happened. The old man listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When Caleb finished, Torino said, "You did the right thing. You protected someone who needed protecting. You didn't escalate. You didn't use force unless necessary, and you maintained control. That's exactly what I've been teaching you." "But I think I made things worse," Caleb said. "He threatened us, both of us. And I know Brett. He's not going to let this go." "Probably not," Torino agreed. "But here's what you need to understand. Things were always going to come to a head eventually. Bullies like him, they push and push until someone pushes back. You were going to have to stand up to him sooner or later. At least now you're ready. At least now you have the skills and the discipline to handle whatever comes." "What if I'm not ready?" Caleb asked quietly. "What if I've been training for 4 months and I'm still not strong enough?" Sensei Torino smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually stern face. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit, Caleb. It's about how much you can endure and still remain yourself. You've been enduring for months, years probably, and you're still here. You're still kind, still decent, still trying to do the right thing. That's real strength. The physical skills, the fighting techniques, those are just tools. The real battle is always internal, against your own fear and doubt and anger. And from what I've seen, you're winning that battle." The words stayed with Caleb as he rode his bike home through the darkening streets. He thought about battles, internal and external, about strength and endurance, and the difference between surviving and thriving. He thought about his father, who'd understood these concepts deeply enough to write about them in his journal, and he thought about what was coming, because something was definitely coming. You didn't challenge someone like Brett Harmon without consequences. The consequences arrived a week later. Caleb was in the parking lot after school, unlocking his bike, when he heard the sound of car engines revving. He looked up to see Brett's Charger and 2 other vehicles, Kyle's truck and Jake's sedan, blocking the exit. Brett, Kyle, Travis, Jake and Dominic climbed out, moving with purpose toward where Caleb stood. "Morrison!" Brett called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "We need to talk." Caleb straightened slowly, his mind racing through his options. He could run. He was faster than all of them now. Months of training had seen to that. He could try to get back into the school building, find a teacher, find safety in numbers. Or he could stay and face this, finally end what had been building for months. He stayed. As they approached, Caleb could see that they'd come prepared for a fight. Brett had a baseball bat, not his own, probably borrowed from someone's car, casual enough to explain away, but threatening nonetheless. Kyle was cracking his knuckles. Travis had something in his pocket that might have been brass knuckles. Jake was recording on his phone again, of course, because why have a fight if you can't post it online? Only Dominic looked uncomfortable, hanging back slightly, his body language screaming reluctance. "Here's how this is going to work," Brett said, stopping about 10 feet away from Caleb. The parking lot had emptied out. Most students had left or were actively avoiding the confrontation. "You've been getting brave lately. Acting tough, protecting your girlfriend. So we're going to teach you a lesson about what happens when you forget your place. We're going to beat you down, right here. And this time there won't be any getting back up. This time you're going to stay down. And then maybe we'll leave you alone. But probably not. Caleb's breathing was calm and controlled. He'd trained for this, not explicitly, but implicitly. Every kata, every sparring session, every lesson about distance and timing and awareness had been preparing him for exactly this moment. "There are 5 of you," he said quietly. "You need 5 people to fight one person who's never hurt anyone. Does that make you feel strong?" Brett's face flushed with anger. "Shut up. You don't get to talk anymore. You don't get to act like you're better than us." "I never said I was better than you," Caleb replied. "I just said I deserved to be treated like a human being. That's all I've ever wanted." "Too bad," Brett said, and he swung the bat. Everything Sensei Torino had taught him came rushing back in that instant. Caleb didn't think. Thinking would have been too slow. He simply reacted, his body moving with the fluid precision that came from months of repetition. He stepped inside the swing, letting the bat pass harmlessly over his shoulder, and drove a sharp punch into Brett's solar plexus. Brett's eyes went wide and he doubled over, the bat falling from his hands as the air rushed out of his lungs. Kyle charged forward with a roar, throwing a wild haymaker that Caleb ducked easily. He swept Kyle's leg out from under him, a basic technique called de ashi barai, and Kyle went down hard on the pavement, his head cracking against the ground with a sound that made everyone wince. Travis was next, pulling what were indeed brass knuckles from his pocket and lunging forward. But brass knuckles only matter if you can land a hit, and Caleb had been training against faster, more skilled opponents for months. He sidestepped, grabbed Travis's extended arm, and used the momentum to send him crashing into the side of Brett's car with a resounding thud. Jake dropped his phone and rushed in, followed closely by Dominic, who seemed to finally commit to the fight. They came from both sides, trying to overwhelm him with numbers, but Caleb had trained for multiple opponents. He kept moving, never staying in one place long enough for them to trap him, using angles and distance to his advantage. He blocked Jake's punch with a sharp elbow strike that left Jake's hand possibly broken, then pivoted to avoid Dominic's grab. He felt bad about what he did next. Dominic had always been the least committed to the bullying, but there was no time for mercy. He executed a perfectly timed Meigeri, a front kick to the midsection that sent Dominic stumbling backward and tripping over the curb. Brett had recovered his breath and was reaching for the bat again, murder in his eyes. "You're dead, Morrison. You're dead." But Caleb got there first, kicking the bat away and then standing over Brett with his fists raised, his stance perfect, his breathing controlled, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "No," he said firmly. "This ends now. I'm not your victim anymore. I'm not anyone's victim. And if you come at me again, I won't hold back like I just did." Brett looked up at him, and Caleb saw something he'd never seen before in those eyes. Genuine fear. Not just surprise or shock, but real, primal fear. Brett had built his entire identity on being the biggest, strongest, most dominant person in every room, and that identity was crumbling. Around them, the other 4 were groaning, trying to get up, nursing injuries that would bruise impressively but weren't serious. Caleb had been careful about that. He'd used enough force to stop them, but not enough to cause lasting damage. That was the lesson his father had tried to teach, the lesson Sensei Torino had reinforced. Control yourself. Control the situation. Control the outcome. A crowd had gathered. Students who'd been watching from safe distances, drawn by the sounds of fighting. They'd seen everything. They'd seen 5 guys with weapons attack one person, and they'd seen that one person defend himself with skill and restraint. They'd seen Brett Harmon, the terror of Ridgemont High, looking up from the ground at Caleb Morrison with fear in his eyes. Someone started clapping. Caleb didn't see who it was at first, but then he recognized Rebecca standing at the edge of the crowd, her hands coming together in steady applause. Others joined in, a scattered recognition of what they'd just witnessed. Not victory. Caleb didn't feel victorious. He felt exhausted and shaky and sick to his stomach. But it was over. Finally, definitively over. A teacher appeared, Mr. Chen, the vice principal, pushing through the crowd with a stern expression. "What is going on here?" he demanded, looking at the scattered bodies, the baseball bat, the obvious signs of a fight. Multiple voices started talking at once, but it was Jenny Martinez, Caleb's lab partner from chemistry, who spoke loudest and clearest. They attacked him, all 5 of them. Brett had a bat. Travis had brass knuckles. Caleb was just defending himself. We all saw it. A chorus of agreement went up from the crowd. Even students who'd never spoken to Caleb, who'd watched him be bullied for months without intervening, were now stepping forward to corroborate his story. Mr. Chen looked at Caleb, then at Brett and his friends, then back at Caleb. "Is this true?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said quietly. "They attacked me. I defended myself. I didn't want to fight anyone." Mr. Chen surveyed the scene again, taking in the witnesses, the weapons, the fact that Caleb was standing uninjured while his attackers were all on the ground or leaning against cars for support. "Everyone involved, come with me to my office. Now. The rest of you, disperse. There's nothing more to see here. The investigation that followed took 2 days and involved multiple interviews, witness statements, and even examination of the video that Jake had been recording before dropping his phone. The footage showed clearly what had happened. 5 students attacking 1, unprovoked, with weapons. It showed Caleb defending himself with controlled, precise movements, never using more force than necessary, stopping when the threat was neutralized. Brett, Kyle, Travis, and Jake were all suspended for 2 weeks and required to attend counseling. Their parents were called in, with Brett's father, who'd always believed his son could do no wrong, forced to confront the reality of what his son had become. Dominic received a lighter punishment because multiple witnesses testified that he'd been reluctant and had only participated under pressure. He was suspended for 1 week and also required to attend counseling. Caleb received no punishment. Mr. Chen even called him into his office privately to apologize. "I should have seen what was happening earlier," he said, looking genuinely regretful. "Students like Brett Harmon, sometimes they're so good at hiding their behavior, or we're so used to seeing them as leaders, that we miss the signs. But that's no excuse. You should have been protected. I'm sorry you had to protect yourself." "It's okay," Caleb said, meaning it. "I needed to learn how to protect myself anyway. It was an important lesson." The story spread through Ridgemont High like wildfire. By the next day, everyone knew every detail, some true, some exaggerated, all contributing to a dramatic shift in the school's social landscape. Caleb Morrison, the invisible nobody, the target, the victim, had become something else entirely. People he'd never spoken to were greeting him in the hallways. Students who'd stood by and watched him be bullied were now trying to be his friend. Even some of Brett's former associates were being friendly, as if they'd never participated in or enjoyed his humiliation. Caleb navigated this new reality with the same careful control he'd learned in his training. He didn't become arrogant or cruel. He didn't seek revenge against those who'd wronged him. He simply existed, with his head up and his shoulders back, confident in who he was and who he was becoming. He continued training with Sensei Torino, continued eating lunch with Rebecca, continued focusing on his studies and his personal growth. Rebecca, who'd witnessed the fight, approached him the day after the suspensions were announced. They were sitting at their usual table in the cafeteria, the one near the windows, and she was sketching while he did homework. "Can I say something?" she asked. "Of course." "What you did yesterday was incredible. Not just the fighting, though that was impressive, but the control. You could have really hurt them. I could see it. You had them completely outmatched. But you held back. You stopped when you could have kept going. She paused, searching for words. That's what heroes do, you know? They use only the force necessary. They don't become what they're fighting against. Caleb felt his face warming. I'm not a hero. I was just trying to survive. No, Rebecca said firmly. You were trying to survive months ago. Yesterday you were trying to protect yourself while maintaining your humanity. There's a difference. And people noticed. She was right. People had noticed. Over the following weeks, Caleb found himself included in ways he'd never been before. He was invited to study groups, to lunch tables, to weekend hangouts. Some of these invitations he accepted, others he politely declined, learning to choose his social interactions carefully rather than desperately clinging to any offered connection. He became friends with Jenny Martinez and discovered she was funny and sharp and had been too scared of social consequences to befriend him before. He got to know Amanda Chen and found out she was dealing with her own family issues. He even had a civil conversation with Dominic Cruz, who apologized sincerely, Caleb thought, for his part in the bullying. I was a coward, Dominic said, his voice thick with shame. I knew what was happening was wrong. I felt sick about it every time, but I was too afraid of becoming a target myself to speak up or stop it. That makes me almost as bad as them. Almost, Caleb agreed, but not quite. Intent matters. You didn't enjoy it. That counts for something. Still, Dominic said, I'm sorry. Really, truly sorry. And I'm glad you learned to stand up for yourself. Someone should have stood up for you earlier. It should have been me or someone else, but we were all too afraid. Caleb accepted the apology because he understood. He'd been too afraid for so long that he couldn't judge others for their fear. Fear was human. What mattered was what you did with it, whether you let it control you or whether you acknowledged it and acted anyway. Brett returned to school after his suspension, quieter and less certain. His father's disappointment, the counseling sessions, the loss of social status, it had all taken a toll. He didn't apologize to Caleb, but he didn't bother him either. They simply avoided each other, occupying different spaces in the school's social ecosystem. Kyle, Travis, and Jake also kept their distance, their former bravado replaced by a wary caution. The hierarchy had shifted, not because Caleb had sought power, but because he demonstrated self-possession. Spring arrived, bringing with it the promise of summer and the end of the school year. Caleb continued training, working toward his green belt, then his blue. His relationship with Rebecca deepened into something romantic, not in a dramatic Hollywood way, but in a gentle, natural way that felt right. They went to movies, took walks in the park, sat together doing homework and talking about their futures. She planned to study art at college. He was considering engineering, and they both understood that their paths might diverge after graduation. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. One evening in May, Sensei Torino asked Caleb to stay after class. When the other students had left, the old teacher sat down on the edge of the practice mat and gestured for Caleb to join him. You've come a long way, Torino said. Not just in skill, though your skill has improved dramatically, but in spirit. You're not the same scared kid who walked through my door 9 months ago. I had a good teacher, Caleb said. You had determination. I just pointed you in the right direction. But here's what I want you to understand. The training never stops. Life will keep throwing challenges at you. Some will be physical, most will be mental and emotional. But the principles you've learned here apply to all of them. Balance, discipline, control, respect. These aren't just fighting techniques. They're life techniques. You use them in your relationships, in your work, in how you treat yourself and others. That's the real value of what you've learned. I understand, Caleb said. I hope so. Because I see something in you, Caleb. Something your father had too. The potential to be truly strong, not in a dominating way, but in a way that lifts others up. You've been through hell, and you came out the other side with your kindness intact. That's rare. Don't lose that. Don't ever lose that. Caleb felt tears prickling at his eyes and didn't try to hide them. Thank you, Sensei, for everything. Thank me by living well, Torino said, by being the man your father wanted you to be, by helping others the way I helped you. That's all the thanks I need. As Caleb rode his bike home that night, he thought about cycles, how pain could create more pain, how cruelty could breed cruelty, but also how strength could inspire strength, how kindness could propagate kindness. He thought about his father, writing in that journal about the kind of person he wanted his son to become. He thought about Sensei Torino, taking time to train a broken kid who'd walked through his door looking for salvation. He thought about Rebecca, choosing to sit with him when he was alone, seeing value in him when others only saw a target. And he thought about himself, about who he'd been 9 months ago and who he was now. The same person in many ways, but fundamentally different in others. He'd learned that strength wasn't about dominating others or never showing vulnerability. It was about knowing yourself, controlling yourself, standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. It was about enduring without becoming hard, about defending yourself without becoming cruel, about rising above your circumstances without forgetting where you came from. The final weeks of school passed in a blur of exams and end-of-year activities. At graduation, because this was the end of his time at Ridgemont High, though the story never explicitly confirmed whether it was high school or college, Caleb sat with Rebecca and his mother, watching as the principal called names and handed out diplomas. When Brett Harmon's name was called, there was polite applause. When Caleb Morrison's name was called, the applause was louder, more genuine, and came from unexpected quarters. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Caleb saw Sensei Torino standing at the back of the auditorium, arms crossed, a small, proud smile on his weathered face. He saw Rebecca beaming from her seat, sketching even now, probably capturing this moment to paint later. He saw his mother crying happy tears, clutching a tissue, looking at him like he was everything she'd hoped he would become. And he saw, in the faces of his classmates, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and something that might have been inspiration. That evening, at a small celebration at his house with just his mother, Rebecca, and Sensei Torino, Caleb opened the journal one more time. He'd read it cover to cover at least a dozen times by now, but there was one passage he kept returning to, one that felt like it had been written specifically for this moment. Today I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of fear. Real bravery isn't about being unafraid, it's about being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. I watched a young Marine freeze up during a training exercise today. He was so afraid of failing, so convinced he couldn't do it, that he nearly didn't try. But his sergeant talked him through it, reminded him that everyone is scared, that fear is just information. It tells you that something matters, that the stakes are high, that you need to focus, but it doesn't get to make your decisions for you. That Marine ended up completing the exercise perfectly. Not because his fear went away, but because he stopped letting it be in charge. Caleb closed the journal and looked around at the people who'd helped him become who he was. His mother, who'd loved him through everything. Rebecca, who'd seen him when he felt invisible. Sensei Torino, who'd taught him that strength was a choice, not a birthright. These were his people, this was his family, and he was no longer the scared, broken kid who'd been shoved face first into a toilet. He was someone who'd faced his fears, done the hard work of transformation, and come out stronger without becoming cruel. The bullies had shoved his face in the toilet, hoping to break him completely. Instead, they'd awakened something in him, a determination to change, to grow, to become someone who couldn't be broken. And when the final confrontation came, when they brought their weapons and their numbers and their rage, he defended himself with precision and restraint, breaking nothing but their hold over him. It wasn't about broken noses, though a couple of those had occurred in the parking lot fight. It was about breaking free from the person he'd been forced to become, about reclaiming himself. As the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Caleb stepped outside into the warm night air. The street was quiet, peaceful, lit by street lamps and the glow from living room windows. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere a car drove past. Ordinary sounds of ordinary life. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Caleb felt like he belonged to that ordinary life. He wasn't a victim or a target or someone who needed to hide. He was just a person, flawed and scarred and still learning, but whole. He thought about tomorrow and next week and next year. He thought about college, about continuing his training, about maintaining his relationships, about facing new challenges that would inevitably arise. And he felt ready. Not because he was unafraid, he would always have fears, but because he knew now that fear didn't have to control him. He could feel it, acknowledge it, and then choose his own path. Behind him, the front door opened and Rebecca stepped out, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool night breeze. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," Caleb said, meaning it completely. "I'm really okay." She smiled and took his hand, and they stood there together under the stars, two people who'd found each other in the midst of chaos and helped each other become better versions of themselves. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. There were no dramatic declarations or swelling music. It was just two people choosing to be present with each other, to support each other, to face whatever came next together. And that, Caleb realized, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Inside the house, his mother was laughing at something Sensei Torino had said. The sound drifted out through the open door, warm and genuine and full of life. Caleb squeezed Rebecca's hand and smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him like a blanket. The story that had started with humiliation and pain had ended with dignity and strength. Not because he'd destroyed his enemies. They were still out there living their own lives, dealing with their own demons, but because he'd discovered that the only person he needed to defeat was his former self, the person who believed he deserved to be treated as less than human. That person was gone now, transformed through discipline and sweat and the patient guidance of people who believed in him. In his place stood someone stronger, kinder, more centered, someone who understood that true power came not from dominating others, but from mastering yourself. Someone who knew that the real victory wasn't in winning fights, though he could do that now if he had to, but in maintaining your humanity while refusing to be victimized. The journey had been long and painful and full of moments when he'd wanted to give up. But he'd persisted, day after day, stance after stance, kata after kata, until the scared boy who'd knelt on that bathroom floor had become a young man who could stand tall and face the world with quiet confidence. And that transformation, invisible though it was to anyone who hadn't watched it unfold, was the greatest victory of all. As he stood there under the stars with Rebecca's hand in his and the sounds of laughter drifting from his house, Caleb Morrison understood that his father's dream had come true. He'd become the kind of person who was strong but not cruel, kind but not weak, capable of defending himself and others without losing his essential goodness. He'd become someone his father would have been proud to know. And that, more than any victory over bullies or any martial arts achievement, was what mattered most. He'd honored his father's memory not by seeking revenge or becoming violent, but by becoming whole. By becoming himself, the best version of himself he could be. The journey would continue because growth never really ended, but the crucial transformation had occurred. He'd gone from victim to survivor, to something more, Someone who could face the world with open eyes and a steady heart, ready for whatever came next. The title of his story had promised that bullies shoved his face in the toilet and he came back and broke their noses. The reality was more nuanced. They'd tried to break him completely and he'd survived. They'd attacked him with weapons and numbers and he'd defended himself with skill and restraint. Some noses might have been broken in the process, Kyle's certainly and Travis's possibly, but that wasn't the point. The point was that he'd broken their hold over him. He'd shattered the narrative that he was weak, that he was powerless, that he deserved to be treated as less than human, and in doing so, he'd freed not just himself, but also inspired others who'd been too afraid to stand up, too convinced that resistance was futile. In the end, the story wasn't about revenge or violence or domination. It was about reclaiming yourself from people who'd tried to take you away. It was about finding the strength to stand when everything in you wanted to fall. It was about learning that you were worth defending, worth fighting for, worth the hard work of transformation. And it was about discovering that the true measure of strength wasn't how much damage you could inflict, but how much you could endure while remaining kind, how much you could survive while staying human, how thoroughly you could win while refusing to become what you fought against. Caleb Morrison had learned all of these lessons, one painful day at a time, one stance at a time, one kata at a time. And now, standing under the stars with his whole life ahead of him, he was ready to take everything he'd learned and build something beautiful with it. Not a legacy of violence or revenge, but a legacy of strength tempered with compassion, of power balanced with restraint, of victory defined not by whom you'd defeated, but by who you'd become. That was the real story. That was what mattered. And as he turned to go back inside, back to the warmth and laughter and love waiting for him, Caleb smiled, because he'd made it. He'd survived the worst that high school and cruel people could throw at him, and he'd come out the other side better than before. The bullies had tried to break him. Instead, they'd forged him into something stronger. And for that, in a strange way, he was almost grateful. Because without the darkness, he might never have learned to appreciate the light. Without the pain, he might never have discovered his own strength. Without hitting rock bottom, he might never have found the determination to climb. Now he stood at the top of that climb, looking back at where he'd been and forward at where he was going, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them the same way he'd faced everything else, with courage, with discipline, with control, and with an unshakable belief in his own worth. The journey had changed him, but it hadn't broken him, and that was the greatest victory of all.